Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to the launch of Yukthi. I'm going to just say a few words by way of introduction, and then we're going to quickly go into the first session, which is a panel on debt justice, on the issue of debt and the question of debt justice. When that panel is done, we will be able to view the launch of Yukthi's website, which is new and still in the process of development. Of course, it will continue to be a living, developing platform. And then we will have the second panel where we will hear directly from activists involved in people's movements and who will share what's happening around the country with us. Thereafter, we will have an open discussion. So that's the format for this afternoon. So once again, welcome to this launch of Yukthi. Now, why are we here? We are here because, contrary to what the newspaper headlines and government politicians would like to tell us, the crisis is not over. The crisis is not over for many, many households and sections of our people. And we are going to hear about some of the ways in which that social and economic crisis endures and is being worsened, is being aggravated by the so-called solutions to the economic crisis in the form of an austerity program designed by the IMF and the government which averts the real causes and reasons for the economic crisis of 2021-2022, which is passing the pain of this crisis onto the poor. And this crisis is not over politically, because the medicine that we are being force-fed is a medicine being administered by a government that does not have legitimacy. A president without a mandate, a parliament which no longer reflects the will of the people of Sri Lanka. So the crisis is not over. Now, who are we? The people in this room, and many people who are not, are those who are part of people's movements and struggles. Activists, researchers, academics, community leaders, working with, defending the rights of the people, of the communities they belong to, of the struggles they are part of. And what we seek to do with Yukthi is to provide a meeting place for these researchers, activists, to come together to speak in unison for the voices of people whose cries are not being heard to be amplified, and to present our responses, our alternatives, not just in the way in which this crisis is being interpreted, but in describing what it actually is and what some ways forward are. So over the course of the next few months and years, what we hope is to gather in strength, to not be distracted by election, the theater around elections, to expand our understanding of democracy to something that happens not just on election day, but every day, and to deepen how we practice democracy in this country. So we insist against the governor of the central bank that it is absolutely vital that all elections be held. It is absolutely vital that people do get to exercise their right to franchise, and that they have, those who created this crisis have absolutely no ground to stand on to say that only their way, only their solution to their crisis is possible, is desirable, is viable. We reject this completely. We demand that the democratic right of our people be respected, and not just on election day, as I said, before, during, and after. And it is no democracy if we are told that the IMF program is untouchable. It is no democracy if we are told that there can be no alternative to the course that the political class has decided to take for the people of this country. That is just drama. Tick a box against a party, against a candidate, but they all give you the same thing. That is not democracy. So we are here to speak out and to share with you some of the things that we have learned, and to hope that you will take these ideas and arguments to the people, to the movements, to the groups that you are part of too. So let me move quickly to the first panel, which is where we are pleased to present the first collective work of Yukthi, where we will hear from Madhulika Gunawardana, researcher with the Feminist Collective for Economic Justice, Ahilan Kadigrama from Jaffna University, and Amali Vedagedara, senior researcher and also activist with the Committee for the Abolition of Illegitimate Debt. So they're going to, the first two speakers will present some work, and this will be complemented by some analysis from Amali. Please, the floor is yours.
I hope you can hear me. Yeah, great. Good evening, everyone. So just going to start off this session today with a small piece of work that we have been working over the last 3 months or so. And in this part where I present is just the introduction to this paper, as well as where it just covers the events that transpired in the debt crisis until so far, and what kind of so-called treatments the establishment has presented. Along with it, I will also give a brief, very brief outline of what kind of impacts this has made to the working class, because the next panel, where I think everyone will go into more depth of what kind of impacts this has, the current trajectory, economic policy trajectory has done to people. So I just start off with mapping out what has happened so far. As of April, it's been 2 years since we defaulted on our external debt. And as everyone knows, like back then, it was just a standstill on debt. We didn't get any support financially from the international architecture. And it's been an year for May, I believe, since the IMF agreement, the 17th IMF agreement. And there we get, for now, I mean, now we get 660 million US dollars annually for the next 4 years. But something that everyone keeps forgetting is that we pay surcharges and interest rates on this IMF loan. And for the next 8 years, from 2024 to 2033, we'll be paying $2 billion as interest rates and surcharges on, or US dollar $2 billion on the IMF loan. So in terms of the treatment of this crisis, what we've seen is that the main focuses have been on primary surplus balance, primary surplus of the government, and targeting inflation so as to reduce it. So in the last year, in 2023, we've gone to a 0.6% surplus in the primary balance, compared to a 3.7 deficit in 2022, and that is a massive jump. And this year, from this year onwards, the central bank expects to control our inflation rate at 5%. So these two targets, in terms of macroeconomic targets, have come at the expense of dispossessing so many people. In terms of the primary surplus, we saw one policy was to bring in price mechanisms to control, to sort of make pricing formulas for energy. And these pricing formulas have increased electricity costs by 400% over the last year itself, last 2 years since 2022. While CEB records profits of 52 billion rupees in the last year, it has come at the cost of dispossessing over 1 million people. Then we had the regressive taxes that we imposed, like the VAT, and this comes at a time at high cost of living. So while 9 out of 10 families have increased their household expenditure, and 6 out of 10 are facing a reduction in their income, on top of this 50% reduction in the real value of their incomes, we see that the government tries to impose more regressive taxes, taxes that, like VAT, that the burden is shared by working people. It's not, taxation should come based on the principle of redistribution, but it's not based on the principles of redistribution. It's rather based on the IMF principle that what is the fastest way of earning a government income, and therefore, let's implement it. Let's go ahead with it. So all these austerity measures are to meet the debt sustainability needs of the IMF through a primary surplus. So we are also dispossessing people in terms of our social protection system, and we know that since during COVID, Sri Lanka was one of the countries that spent the least amount on social protection, and right now the IMF program itself has capped the spending on social protection at a 0.6% of GDP, and there have been massive cuts to the social protection through the new Asvasuma program. And this doesn't only mean dispossessing people of any financial assistance from the state, it also means dispossessing them the right to connect and engage with the state. We also saw one of the last treatments is that instead of restructuring our external debt, which is the debt we defaulted on, we first went and restructured our superannuation funds, our EPF and ETF. These cuts are the only savings to working people, as everyone knows. And because of the crisis that materialized in 2020, people have faced a reduction in the value of their EPF by 40%. And on top of it, in the next 10 years, we will see a reduction in the value of their savings by 30% more. So these so-called treatments are not just happening to the lives that people are realizing living presently, but through these reforms, we are going to see an onslaught on people's futures. And it's all just to treat an external debt crisis. So why are we here for the 17th time at the IMF? What happened to the last 16 agreements? All these solutions are focused on liberalizing trade, making sure that we are dependent on imports, and therefore undermining local production. It also comes at the fire sale of local assets, of public assets, and state-owned enterprises, and services that people access. And why are we going through this entire structural reform process is to return to private credit markets for development. And there lies the problem. Why are we relying on private commercial credit for development, for mitigating and facing climate risks? This is not just a problem for Sri Lanka. It's a problem for the entire global south and therefore a global crisis. We are in a global debt crisis. Since the global financial crisis in 2007, the debt of developing countries have doubled. 62% of developing countries' external debt are owed to private creditors. We are relying on private credit for our development needs. So the problem here with the private credit markets is, the biggest problem is that there is a discrepancy in the charges that we owe and pay to these private creditors. So when the UNCTAD has done a report on this, and it stated that when Germany pays at least 1.5% in charges for the private credit they get, countries like Africa pay 11%, and Asian countries pay about 6.5%, whereas America, the USA, pays about 3.1%. So we are charged this extra fee called the risk premium, but when this risk transpires, we're still owed the entirety of our debt. We are not given bigger cuts even when this risk materializes. So in developing countries, we pay about 60.5% of our public expenditure to repay debts, whereas we pay 40% for education, 55% for health. And this is a massive problem when it comes to countries like us. Where do we go to get debt? We still need debt, sure. But is the private credit markets the place to go? No. Then why is the IMF keeps on pushing us to go into these markets? Why are we doing all these reforms to make sure that we are attractive enough to go and return back to these markets. Since COVID, there have been so many countries in the global south that have defaulted. Ghana, Suriname, Zambia, Lebanon, Sri Lanka just been one. We have been able to get out of our IMF agreements previously, but this time it's really hard for us because we have defaulted on this credit. And I think Amali and Dr. Ahilan will present more on this. So the treatments for this crisis are repeatedly treating our cases of debt crisis as a national governance and economic governance crisis, as opposed to, and a corruption issue, as opposed to a corruption issue of the larger global financial architecture. So with that, I will end and hand it over to Dr. Ahilan.
Thanks very much, Madhulika. And what we heard from Madhulika was to once again remind us about the nature of the crisis that millions of households in our country are facing, a crisis when it comes to being off the grid, disconnected from electricity, a crisis when it comes to being afford to meet basic household expenses because of this regressive value-added tax, which punishes the poor always more than those who are better off. A situation which many of you will be familiar with, where the number of dropouts in our schools, children being pulled out of education has increased, an ongoing problem of unemployment, and still, of course, large numbers seeking to migrate out of this country because they simply do not see a future for themselves here. And Madhulika also, remember, located the Sri Lankan debt crisis within the crisis of debt in the global south. The question that we must ask ourselves is, if the medicine is the right medicine, why is it that since 1982 and the Mexican debt crisis, more countries are in the debt trap? More countries have a larger stock or volume of debt. More countries are having to enter into these austerity programs. So if the medicine has been the right medicine, why is it not working? Why is it killing the patient? So let's hear now from Ahilan.
Good evening. So as we heard from Madhulika, the IMF program, the IMF solution is actually making the crisis worse. Now, if the IMF solution is making the crisis worse, what is the way out of this? This is the 17th IMF agreement, but the 17th IMF agreement is different because Sri Lanka has defaulted on its debt, and the IMF is considered the arbiter for debt resolution by the Paris Club, for example, and they require an IMF program for debt restructuring. So in that sense, the IMF has a stranglehold on us. What they say is, if you don't have the IMF program, then you cannot have debt resolution. So what is the way out? The problem is that there is, first of all, a conflict of interest in the role of the IMF. The IMF is considered an arbiter for debt resolution, but the IMF is also a lender. And as we heard from Madhulika, this so-called IMF bailout, $3 billion US, it translates to just about $60 million US a month, whereas Sri Lanka's foreign earnings is 30 times that much, $1,800 million US. So there is no IMF bailout, But what the IMF is going to do to us is that over the next 10 years, for this $3 billion US dollar loan, we are going to pay $2 billion US dollars in interest payments. Right? So there is no IMF bailout, there is extraction by the IMF, while the IMF claims that it is the arbiter. So there is clearly a conflict of interest. So we have to think of other arbiters, other ways of restructuring this debt. And this is not just about Sri Lanka, this is the case for so many other countries in the global south. Now, how do we view this large debt stock? In the case of Sri Lanka, if we include all our external debt on the order of 51 billion US dollars. First of all, it is justified that this debt should be reduced because over our post-colonial period, not only Sri Lanka, so many countries, there has been a constant extraction of countries like ours by the Western world through what is called the terms of trade, for example. Our exports earn much less and they earn much more by exporting to us. Much of this debt can be characterized as odious debt. This is not debt that benefited the people. This is debt that was used to extract from the Sri Lankan people by external creditors, as well as by our own elite, the people sitting in government today. And they are the ones who are deciding how this debt is going to be restructured. And finally, what do we do if we cannot repay this debt? Unless there is cancellation, there is no other way forward. So there are many justifications why this debt needs to be greatly reduced. But what is the IMF saying? According to the IMF, through this debt restructuring process, and the government has also come out and said they're just going to reduce it by 30%. Reducing the debt stock by 30% would mean our total debt, external and domestic together, is going to be 95% of our GDP. The next shock is just going to push us back into default. So this is not sustainable. While the IMF and the government might speak about 30% reduction of debt, the bondholders with whom the government is negotiating are talking about 20% and even possibly 10% reduction of debt. In other words, they don't really care about Sri Lanka coming out of this debt crisis. The IMF, and to some extent our government, and definitely the donors, all they care about is that the creditors are repaid. That is the process. And once the creditors are repaid, what is the end program of this IMF program? What is the end goal of it? It is so that we can again go and float an international sovereign bond. It says that in the IMF agreement. Now, what needs to happen? This sort of debt resolution, this sort of debt arbitration is not going to take us anywhere. It is going to lead to the 18th IMF agreement and our second default. So what we need is a different process of debt arbitration. There might have to be a process maybe by another agency of the United Nations. We may have to convene a debt conference in Sri Lanka and start talking to the donors ourselves. We may have to make some tough decisions that maybe it doesn't make sense to go and borrow in the commercial markets. Because what did we do with our commercial market borrowing? Most of our international sovereign bonds, the interest payments were equal to the principal. We've already repaid the entire amount and more. And they want us to keep repaying. We might have to change the kind of economic policies that we take forward. if we allow our donors to decide, if we allow our elite to decide, we're going to have the highways, we're going to have the Lotus Tower. Does that lead to sustainable returns? No. We need a different process of development. We need planning, we need industrial policies, we need to deal with our food crisis, we need to focus on our food system. But these are policies that the IMF, the World Bank, the donors don't want us to take forward. They say no to industrial policies, while in the Western world, today, what is Biden doing? They're talking about industrial policies for the United States. The crisis in Sri Lanka is also about not planning. So we need to rethink all of that. So it is this kind of approach, and we can't do this alone. We need to link up with other countries that are in debt. We need a debtors coalition. We need to come together to be able to challenge the creditors. Sri Lanka by itself will be isolated, and this kind of restructuring will be imposed. But we all know the international financial system is broken. We need a new global financial architecture. Even the UN Secretary General has more or less come out and said this. Everybody knows it, but the political will has to come from our governments, not the kind of government that we have in power today. We need a different government. We need different governments around the world. But to start with, people's movements have to come together around the world and demand debt cancellation. So this is a large task, but we have to begin there. இறுதியாக நான் சில வார்த்தைகளை தமிழ்லையும் கூற விரும்புகின்றேன். இன்று நாங்கள் இந்த கடன் பிரச்சனை சம்பந்தமாக பேசிக்கொண்டிருக்கின்றோம். ஏற்கனவே முன்வைச்ச கருத்துக்கள் படி இந்த IMF உடைய சர்வதேச நாணய நிதியத்துடைய இந்த தீர்வு அல்லது திட்டம் என்பது ஒரு தீர்வு அல்ல. இதை எங்கள் மேலதிகமான ஒரு நெருக்கடிக்குள் தான் தள்ளிக்கொண்டு இருக்கின்றது. இதிலிருந்து நாங்கள் வெளிவருவதாக இருந்தால் நாங்கள் வித்தியாசமான அணுகுமுறைகளை முன்னெடுக்க வேண்டிய தேவை இருக்கின்றது. நிச்சயமாக இலங்கை போன்ற நாடுகளுக்கு, இது இலங்கை மட்டுமல்ல இவ்வாறான ஒரு கடன் நெருக்கடிக்குள் இருக்கின்றது. உலகத்தில் 50க்கு மேற்பட்ட நாடுகள் இவ்வாறான கடன் நெருக்கடிக்குள், ஒரு கடன் பொறிக்குள் விழுந்திருக்கின்றன. அதிலிருந்து நாங்கள் மீண்டெழுவதாக இருந்தால் இந்த கடன் அடிப்படையில் பாதிக்கப்படும் நாடுகள் இணைந்து அவர்களுக்கான ஒரு இணைப்பூடாக நாங்கள் கோரிக்கைகளை முன்வைக்க வேண்டிய தேவை இருக்கின்றது. IMF இலங்கையுடைய கடன்களை தீர்க்கதிலும் பார்க்க, IMF உடைய கடன் 3 பில்லியன் அமெரிக்கன் டாலருக்கான கடனுக்கு நாங்கள் அடுத்த 10 வருட காலத்தில் 2 பில்லியன் அமெரிக்கன் டாலர் வட்டியை கட்டப் போகின்றோம். இவ்வாறான உடைமை இழப்பு தான் இந்த IMF உடைய தீர்வு என்று கூட கூறப்படுகின்றது. அந்த விதத்தில் இவ்வாறு கடன்பட்ட நாடுகள் இணைந்து கோரிக்கையை முன்வைக்க வேண்டிய தேவை இருக்கின்றது. ஆனால் எங்களுக்கு தெரியும், எங்களுடைய தற்போது இருக்கும் அரசாங்கமோ பல நாடுகளில் இருக்கும் அரசாங்கங்களும் இவ்வாறான தீர்வை முன்வைக்கப் போவதில்லை. ஆகவே மக்கள் இயக்கங்கள், மக்களுடைய போராட்டங்களூடாக மூன்றாம் உலகத்தை சேர்ந்த மக்கள் இணைந்து கோரிக்கைகளை முன்வைக்க வேண்டிய தேவை இருக்கின்றது. நன்றி, வணக்கம்.
Nandri Island. What Island reminded us of is that the current approach to so-called restructuring of our debt, two things. One is it just kicks the can down the road. It does not deal with the problem. Remember that up to now, until even if this IMF program carries on, what we've been doing is servicing, paying, repaying multilateral debt. But come 2027, they will come for their money. So all this talk about how our reserves are rising by the month, 1 year of debt repayment not just will wipe that out, but there just simply will not be enough in the treasury even to repay 1 year worth of debt repayments post-2027. So the can is being kicked down the road. And secondly, as Ahilan very importantly reminded us, debt restructuring is not the same as debt justice. Debt justice, those who did not take those decisions, those who did not benefit from the loans that were taken, are being asked to repay them. Those who did take those loans are scot-free and on their way to Australia. So that what is happening now is not debt justice. Debt justice is differentiating between financing which had a positive development outcome for the people of Sri Lanka and that which went into the pockets of the elite. So let's now hear from Amali, who will focus also on the issue of private credit, of what's been in the news recently around negotiations with private creditors. Remember, 48% of our debt as of 2022 was owned by these private creditors. And you heard from Madhulika about how much globally too, right? And you heard from Ahilan how the objective of this IMF loan is to go back to the very same people who are now demanding more than their pound of flesh from us. So let's hear from Amali.
Thank you, Kumar. Welcome you all to the launch of Yukthi, where we are trying to, I think, create an alternative imagination, open up the space and create alternative imaginations to go beyond the noose that we are going to be stuck in. I think the government has announced that the debt restructuring will be concluded in June, which means that our fate is going to be sealed for the foreseeable future. And we are looking forward for elections, new governments, but the parties or the political power alliances that are going to come to power in the coming months will have this sealed fate, and we are going to be put inside the debtor's prison. Of course, it's not an enclosure, but an open prison, right? Where our fiscal and economic, monetary and economic sovereignty will be sealed. So Ahilan and Madhulika pointed out how IMF is not the arbiter. It is actually the part of a problem. It is the part of the problem. That the fact that we are going to the IMF for the 17th time. And if you look at the world experiences from Africa to Latin America, we have enough evidences to show that IMF is not the answer. It is part of the problem. And we are, I think, now loudly acknowledging today that the second default is built in to the plan. And how the second default will be, we saw that the first default already has beaten the working people. Their pension funds have borne the exclusive brunt of a domestic debt restructuring. And can we even imagine what the second default will have, right? What will be the consequences, and would we have the resilience to face the second default? Because we are and I think as Ahilan and Madhulika pointed out, unlike previous IMF engagements, 17th engagement has been making permanent changes to the Sri Lankan socio-economic polity and political polity. They are emphasizing on legal reforms. So our character of the Sri Lankan state and our society and the economy has been radically changed. We are dismantling the developmental infrastructure of our economy, right? We are in the course of a privatization process, and we might be opening up our public enterprises to the grabs of some of these bondholders. I think we have woken up to the possibilities with VFS and Blackstone being one of the investors, right? Blackstone is already in Sri Lanka. They have invested in Primal Glass. So they are already there. And we don't know about we don't even know who our bondholders are, because 72% of the bondholders are hidden. We don't know about them. We only know a couple of them. So this is the scenarios that we are dealing with. So, and I think Ahilan also spoke about how we should really dissent the solutions that we are presented with, form an alliance. The other developing countries are already getting into alliances. In Africa, in Latin America, Sri Lanka cannot fight this alone. There has to be a southern alliance of developing countries. And I would like to, I'm not going to actually speak about the private creditors, but about this, speak more to the new nature of this debt crisis that we are in, and to open up a discussion for a possible pathway that Sri Lanka has not, we in Sri Lanka, has kind of shied away from. That's the odious debt discourse. So, many of you would know what odious debt is. Basically, there are two criteria to determine what odious debt is. One criteria will be that the debt incurred have not spent in the interest of the public, that the debt is not used for the public investments for the benefit of the larger public. The other one will be to talk about the creditor's responsibility, that we all talk about debt restructuring, and the government and the bondholders have, and the Paris Club have presented their deals. So it seemed like that we are bounded to this fate of repaying our debt at whatever cost. We mean the working people of Sri Lanka, right? And we don't seem to have any kind of negotiation or space to negotiate, space to arbitrate, right? Space to demand a greater cut of our debt stock. This is what we at least see from what the government present to us. The debt restructuring deal that the government presented is worse than the debt restructuring deal that the bondholders have presented, right? So we wonder, on whose side does our government stand? On whose side does the central bank stand? So then we would wonder whether maybe the government is kind of helpless. So what kind of debt negotiation platform leads a government, a sovereign government? I think let's forget that this particular government does not have a mandate, but they are representing a sovereign country, Sri Lanka, right? So what kind of debt restructuring platform or a framework leads a sovereign government helpless, right? So I think I think that also speaks to the nature of the international financial architecture that the IMF and the World Bank tries to safeguard, that they are coming again and again by pretending to bail us out, but in fact trying to trap us into this particular system. So in my opinion, odious debt provides us a way out. So by pointing out that, there's the responsibility is also at the level of the creditors. It's not only at the level of the indebted country and the people. In Sri Lanka, we talk about corruption. It is part of our daily conversation, right? We have, gone through Aragalaya, where the corruption of the political elite and the economic elite made the headlines. And I think that was a greater impetus in driving Aragalaya itself. And our political parties talk about corruption and need for good governance. The IMF itself has come up with the governance diagnostic report and point out at corruption as making it seem like a private problem, that it is this developing third world poor countries plagued with corruption. But the problem is that corruption, if you look at how it has worked over decades, corruption is actually part of the strategy. The ruling elite and the economic elite from 1977 have made use of corruption to dismantle the public state, the public services and the public infrastructure. So it is actually the gateway for their private interest, right? Privatization is, to legitimize privatization. But I think we in the left, in the progressive circles, though as much as we are acknowledging corruption, have not incorporated corruption into the discussion of debt, public debt. If we do, I think odious debt should not seem like a kind of a, hypothetical scenario. Because odious debt is, there are countries, even in the recent past, there's concrete examples of where countries from the developing countries use the odious debt framework. And odious debt is not only a hypothetical thing, there's a legal doctrine, the doctrine of odious debt. They have used countries like Ecuador, Iraq in 2003, Ecuador in 2007 and 8, used the doctrine of odious debt or illegitimate debt to reduce their debt stock in a significant proportion. So it gives us a leverage, actually, to fight with the bondholders and the other bilateral and multilateral creditors. Like we have acknowledged that multilateral debt in Sri Lanka will not be restructured. We are paying. ADB is the largest multilateral creditor in Sri Lanka. So while we are shying away from the odious debt framework, we already have the ground material. The Auditors General Department has done the groundwork and have given us the preliminary material to begin our task. So I'd like to kind of quote from 3 Special Auditor General reports presented in 2018, 2019, and 2022. So there, the Auditor General remarks, by December 31st, 2016, gap between total debt payable by government of Sri Lanka and value of total debt finance assets was 7.8 trillion Sri Lankan rupees. So this is the gap between the borrowing and the assets, debt finance assets. So the total debt payable stood at 2016 stood at 8.9 trillion, and total assets was only worth of 1.1 trillion. So where did this gap, where did the money go if the loans did not materialize in creating concrete assets? And the Auditor General's report points out that significant portion of the net borrowing was used for recurrent purposes. So it's like for daily needs, right? And there's a lot of problems in accounting public debt and debt finance assets. Central Bank is and Ministry of Finance and Treasury, they are the key responsible government entities to record these transactions, as well as the central bank has an extra responsibility because they have the mandate to manage public debt. And the Auditor General points out towards the culpability of the central bank for that they have not accomplished its responsibility for operating borrowings to maximize benefits for the public. And he also finds non-compliance with laws, rules, and regulations in case of foreign borrowing. So this preliminary material gives us enough room and substance to construct the odious debt campaign, to demand or to call that Sri Lanka's public debt is as odious. Then I think we can demand, I think as Ahilan pointed out, we cannot agree that IMF is the arbiter, they are not. So we can demand for an international commission, independent international commission, or we ourselves can formulate a commission and conduct a debt audit, like other countries, like the Ecuador, and Mexico, or even in Greece, though in Greece it failed. All these countries conducted debt audits to understand the nature of the legitimacy of the debt composition. And there are international experts, if we want to call for their assistance. Eric Toussaint from CADTM has worked a lot on third world debt and illegitimate debt. There is Lyon's Nidhi Kumani and James Boyce from University of Perry Institute from University Amherst. Then there are others like Michael Hudson who have spoken in great deal about odious debt. I think there are these options that we should pursue, right, without waiting in silence or being helpless before our fate is sealed into the debtor's prison. Thank you.
Thank you, Amali, for reminding us how many of the changes that are taking place in the name of so-called economic reform or economic recovery risk being irreversible. When you start to dismantle something, you dismantle our education system, you dismantle our health system, people forget, once upon a time, nobody talks about entitlements to food any longer. We've already forgotten. We've forgotten that once upon a time it was possible to protect people's right to food through price controls, through a system of provision of basic foods, through guaranteeing the poorest households access to a basic nutritional intake. That was dismantled. And see, 40 years later, none of us speak about it. We've already lost it. We've already forgotten. And this will be the story when it comes to our system of public education and public health. This is the way it will go too. The same way protection of the right to food is erased, even from the memory of progressive movements and organizations. Even during an economic crisis which hits people in their stomachs, where we know that there are families, there are individuals who have cut back on the number of meals, who cut back on the quality of the food that they eat. This is happening today, still in this country. But we don't hear them. These people are invisible. So let's now, before we move to the second panel, have Sakuna come and show us the website that is being launched today, and to show us what it looks like. And then Melanie will moderate the next session, where we will hear testimonies and evidence from researchers and activists and leaders. Sakuna, please.
Lights one. Touch shooting. Thank you, Kumar. First of all, I would like to say something about the website and its collaboration and the purpose. I think today is a kind of a special day. It's kind of a day of hope, expectations, and unity and empowerment. So it's not just like we are launching a web platform. It's kind of a movement which is supporting the multiple people struggles. So we know we all faced a lot of issues in the past, especially after the 2019 and even before. So there are a lot of misunderstanding about these aspects and how we should overcome through these things. So we are supposed to make an effort with the knowledge of researchers, journalists, and unionists, politicians, and many of others to go towards a different path. So the Yukthi SL.org is a kind of a effort for that. So we would like to introduce it right now. I will show you the new website for a while. This is the new website. So, so there are like certain aspects that we are currently trying to like focus on, mainly the economic justice and debt justice. But there are like certain other aspects, multiple aspects that we are seeking for justice for a long time and short time, and especially very need for the upcoming future. So I think like when we are step towards a different kind of a era, so we need a change. So I think like these platforms will be helpful for that, and I would like to like invite all of you for collaborate with this side with your thoughts, suggestions and ideas, and even articles and related aspects, and it's kind of a completely open platform. So also like today there was some discussion about the some papers related to debt justice and all. You all can find all those things in this platform. Thank you very much. I would like to invite Melanie for Melanie and Yadusha for moderate the next panel discussion. So platform is open for you.
Hi, good evening, everyone, and thank you for making time to be here. So we are hoping to start the next panel discussion with a few of the colleagues, including Iromi Pereira. So please come on stage. Yeah.
I would also like to invite Mr. Annalingam Anarasa on stage from Kites Fisheries Cooperative Societies Union.
And Mrs. Shamala Kumar, please come on stage. Viduramuna Singha from Law and Society Trust.
Also, I would like to invite Baby Shalini Rajeshwaran from the Young Researchers Network. அனைவருக்கும் வணக்கம். நாங்கள் இன்று முதல் நடந்த கலந்துரையாடலின்படி பார்க்கும்போது நாங்கள் முக்கியமாக ஒரு வரலாற்று திருப்புமுனையில் இருக்கிறோம். குறிப்பாக நவதாராளவாத கொள்கைகள் மற்றும் அதன் பின்னரான பொருளாதார நெருக்கடி, இப்பொழுது நாங்கள் சந்தித்து கொண்டிருக்கும் கடன் நெருக்கடி மற்றும் பொருளாதார நெருக்கடி காரணமாக சமூகத்தில் ஏற்பட்டுள்ள ஏற்றத்தாழ்வுகள் அது அதிகரித்து கொண்டு செல்கிற நிலையில் வந்து நாங்கள் இந்த கலந்துரையாடலை ஏற்பாடு செய்திருக்கிறதுக்கான காரணம் இங்கு சில தலைவர்கள் செயற்பாட்டாளர்கள் மற்றும் ஆய்வாளர்கள் தமது அனுபவங்களையும் தமது உழைக்கும் மக்களின் வாழ்க்கை சம்பந்தமான பிரச்சனைகளையும் எம்மோடு கலந்துரையாடுவதற்காக
Amisa, I'm sorry that we couldn't mention your name. Please do come on stage.
கடந்த கலந்துரையாடலில் குறிப்பிடப்பட்டது போல உழைக்கும் மக்கள் எவ்வாறு இந்த நெருக்கடி எவ்வாறு உழைக்கும் மக்களை மீது தாக்கம் செலுத்துகிறது, அதற்காக முன்மொழியப்படும் தீர்வுகளும் கூடவே அவர்களை மேலும் மேலும் பிரச்சனைக்குள்ளும் நெருக்கடிக்குள்ளும் தள்ளும் நிலை காணப்படுகிறது என்பதை விளங்கிக் கொள்வதற்காகத்தான் இந்த கலந்துரையாடல் ஏற்பாடு செய்யப்பட்டுள்ளது. இதற்காக முதலாவதாக தனது அனுபவங்களையும் இந்த நெருக்கடியின் தாக்கம் கடற்தொழிலாளர் சமூகம் மீது எவ்வாறு உள்ளது என்பதை குறித்து கலந்துரையாடுவதற்கும் நான் திரு அனலிங்கம் அன்னராசா அவர்களை அழைக்கிறேன். அன்னராசா அவர்கள் ஊர்காவற்துறை கடற்தொழிலாளர்கள் கூட்டுறவு சங்கங்களின் சமாசத்தின் செயலாளராக இருக்கிறார்.
அனைவருக்கும் இந்நேர வணக்கத்தை தெரிவித்துக் கொண்டு, இன்றைய சூழ்நிலையிலே நமது நாடு எதிர்நோக்கின்ற பிரச்சனையிலே பல உண்மைகள் வெளிக்கொண்டு வரப்படாமல், எங்களுடைய உரிமை சார்ந்த பிரச்சனைகள் வெளிக்கொண்டு வரப்படாமல் ஒடுக்கப்பட்டு கொண்டிருக்கின்ற சூழ்நிலையிலே இன்றைய தினம் இந்த யுக்தி இணையதளம் என்பது உருவாக்கப்பட்டது வரவேற்கக்கூடிய ஒரு விஷயமாகவும், எதிர்கால எங்களுடைய இளைஞர்களுக்கு எங்களுடைய நாட்டின் பிரச்சனையை வெளிக்கொண்டு வருவதற்கும் அறிந்து கொள்வதற்கும் ஒரு வனப்பிரதாசமாக இருக்கும் என்று அதனை நாங்கள் வரவேற்று கொள்வதோடு, அதே போன்றுதான் நாங்கள் வடமாகாணத்திலே யாழ் மாவட்டத்திலே கடற்றொழிலாளர்கள் அல்லது உழைக்கும் வர்க்கத்தினர் மிகப்பெரிய பாதிப்பினை எதிர்கொண்டிருக்கின்றோம். குறிப்பாக கொரோனா கால தாக்கத்தில் இருந்து நாங்கள் மீள்வதற்கு இடையிலே நாட்டிலே ஏற்பட்ட பொருளாதார நெருக்கடி அல்லது கடற்றொழிலாளர்கள் மீது வளமிக்க கடல் எங்களுடைய பிரதேசங்களிலே இருக்கின்றது. அதனை வளப்படுத்தி எமது நாட்டின் இறையாண்மையை அல்லது எங்களுக்கு அந்நிய செலாவணியை பெற்று எங்கள் தொழிலாளர்களுடைய இருப்பையும் வாழ்வாதாரத்தையும் கொண்டு செல்வதற்கு தடையாக இந்த அரசாங்கங்கள் அமைந்திருக்கின்றது. அதிலும் குறிப்பாக மீனவர்களின் பாதிப்பு என்பது வெளிநாடுகளுக்கு எங்களுடைய கடல் வளங்களை விற்பதும், எங்களுடைய உழைக்கும் வர்க்கத்தினரை கடல் தொழிலை விட்டு அந்நியப்படுத்தி கடலை விட்டு ஓரம் கட்டுகின்ற ஒரு செயல்பாடு பொருளாதார நெருக்கடியிலே இருந்து மீள்வதற்கு ஏற்றுமதி என்ற ஒரு போர்வையினாலே வடக்கிலே எங்களுடைய வாழ்வாதாரமும் கடல் தொழிலும் அழிக்கப்பட்டு நாங்கள் அந்நியப்பட்டு கொண்டிருக்கின்றோம். இருந்தும் கூட எங்களுடைய குரலை வடக்கிலே நாங்கள் தொடர்ந்து வலியுறுத்தி வந்தாலும் இந்த அரசாங்கங்கள் அதனை புறக்கணித்து கொண்டிருக்கின்றன. அல்லது இந்த அரசாங்கத்தின் கொள்கைகள் என்பது எங்களுடைய கடலையும் எங்களுடைய நாட்டின் மீது எங்களுக்கு இருக்கிற இறைமையையும் முதலாளித்துவத்திற்கும் அந்நிய நாடுகளிற்கும் அடிமைப்படுகிற ஒரு செயல்பாட்டை இந்த அரசாங்கம் அல்லது இந்த ஆட்சியாளர்கள் செய்து கொண்டிருக்கின்றார்கள். அது மிகப்பெரிய பாதிப்பை வடக்கிலே இந்த கடற்றொழில் சமூகம் மீது உருவாக்கி கொண்டிருக்கின்றது. அதே போன்றுதான் இந்த பொருளாதார நெருக்கடிக்கு பிந்திய காலங்களிலே கடற்றொழிலாளர்களின் வாழ்வாதாரத்திலே இந்த கடன் என்பது மிகப்பெரிய பாதிப்பையும் எங்களுடைய பெண்களினுடைய வாழ்வாதாரத்தில் மிகப்பெரிய பாதிப்பை உருவாக்கி நிற்கின்றது. அதே போன்றுதான் இந்த கடன் பெற்று நாங்கள் கடற்றொழிலிலே எங்களுடைய இறமையுள்ள கடலிலே தொழிலிலே ஈடுபடலாம் என்று வங்கிகளிலே அல்லது தனியார் நிறுவனங்களிலே கடனை பெற்று தொழில் செய்ய நாங்கள் முயற்சித்தால் கூட வெளிநாடுகளின் படகுகள் எங்களுடைய வளத்தை அளிப்பதனால் எங்களுடைய வாழ்வாதாரத்தை கொண்டு செல்ல முடியாமல் எங்களுடைய தொழில் உபகரணங்களும் அளிக்கப்பட்டு அந்த கடனை மீள் செலுத்த முடியாமல் கடன் வங்கிகளுக்கு நாங்கள் அடிமையாகி எங்களுடைய தொழிலை விட்டு எங்களுடைய இருப்பிடங்களை விட்டு நாங்கள் மறைந்து வாழக்கூடிய ஒரு நிலைமையை கடந்த 3 வருடங்களிலே வடக்கிலே நாங்கள் கடற்றொழிலாளர்கள் பாதிக்கப்பட்டு கொண்டிருக்கிறோம். அதிலும் குறிப்பாக 50,000 குடும்பங்களை பிரதிநிதிப்படுத்துகின்ற 2 லட்சம் மக்கள் வடமாகாணத்திலே இந்த கடற்தொழிலை நம்பி நாங்கள் மிகப்பெரிய பாதிப்பையும் முதலாளி வர்க்கத்துக்கு அடிமையாகக்கூடிய ஒரு செயல்பாட்டை இந்த எங்கள் மீது திணிக்கப்படுகிறது. எங்களுடைய குரல்கள் கூட வடக்கில் இருந்து ஏனைய சகோதர இலங்கை மக்களுக்கு வெளியில் வர்றது கூட மிகப்பெரிய குறையாக இருக்கின்றது. ஆனால் இன்றைய யுக்திய இணையதளம் ஊடாக எங்களுடைய பிரச்சனைகளும் எங்களுடைய மக்களின் பிரச்சனைகளும் நாங்களும் இலங்கை நாடு இலங்கை எங்களுடையது என்று வாழ நினைத்தால் எங்களை வாழ்வதற்கும் அல்லது அதை நோக்கி கொண்டு செல்வதற்கும் இந்த அரசாங்கங்கள் தயாராக இல்லை. ஏனென்றால் எங்கள் மீது கடன் சுமை அதிகரிக்கப்பட்டிருக்கின்றது. வங்கிகள் கடன் தராவிட்டால் எங்களுடைய வீட்டிலே வந்து நின்று கோன் அடிக்கின்றது. கோணுகள் அடிக்கும்போது செலுத்த முடியாமல் விட்டால் ஒழிச்சு வாழ வேண்டிய ஒரு நிலையும் மறைந்து வாழ வேண்டிய ஒரு நிலையும் இந்த கடற்தொழிலை நம்பி நாங்கள் சுதந்திரமாக உழைச்சி எங்களுடைய பிள்ளைகளின் கல்வியிலே வளர்ச்சியிலே முன்னோக்கி சென்று கொண்டிருந்த நாங்கள் கடந்த 3 வருடங்களில் அது மிகப்பெரிய பாதிப்பாக எங்களுக்கு அமைந்திருக்கின்றது. அதே போன்றுதான் இலங்கையிலே இருக்கின்ற கடல் வளம் மிக பெரியது. ஆனால் எங்களுடைய கடல் வளத்திலே நாங்கள் ஏற்றுமதியை செய்வதற்கு பதிலாக வெளிநாடுகளிலே இருந்து தகரத்திலே அடிக்கப்பட்ட மீன்களை இறக்கி உங்களுக்கும் எங்களுக்கும் சாப்பாட்டுக்கு தயாராகத்தான் அரசாங்கம் எங்களையும் உங்களையும் முன்னோக்கி கொண்டு சென்று இருக்கின்றது. ஆனால் எங்கள்கிட்ட இருக்கிற வளத்தில் எங்களை மக்களுக்கு அந்த மீனை பிடிச்சி யுத்தத்துக்கு முன்பு 1983-84 ஆண்டு காலப்பகுதிகளிலே வடக்கிலே இருந்து 3/2 பங்கு மீனை நாங்கள் இலங்கைக்கு இந்த ஏனைய மாவட்டங்களுக்கு ஏற்றுமதி செய்த சமூகம். ஆனால் இன்று தகரத்தில் அடைக்கப்பட்ட டின் மீனை சாப்பிடக்கூடிய ஒரு நிலையை இந்த அரசாங்கம் உருவாக்கி கொண்டிருக்கின்றது. தொடர்ந்தும் அதைத்தான் செய்கின்றது. அதிலும் குறிப்பாக இந்த IMF போன்ற நாடுகள் தங்களுடைய நலனுக்காக எங்களுடைய நாட்டிலே சட்டங்களை கொண்டு வந்து தங்களுடைய வசதிக்காக அந்த சட்டங்களை மாற்றி கடற்தொழிலாளர் மீது திணிக்கின்றது. புதிய சட்ட வரைவு ஒன்றை கொண்டு வருகிறது இந்த அரசாங்கம். ஆனால் இருக்கிற சட்ட வரைவு மிகவும் பழமையானது, மிகவும் திறமையான சட்ட வரைவுகளை நடைமுறைப்படுத்தாத அரசாங்கம் வெளிநாட்டு நிறுவனங்களின் விருப்பத்துக்காக புதிய மீன்பிடி கொள்கை என்று கொண்டு வந்து எங்களை ஒரு முதலாளி வர்க்கத்துக்கு அடிமையாக்கின்ற ஒரு சட்ட வரைவைத்தான் இன்று அரசாங்கம் தயாரித்து கொண்டிருக்கின்றது. அதற்கு வடக்கு மக்கள் தொடர்ந்தும் எதிர்ப்பினை தெரிவித்து வந்தாலும் அரசாங்கம் செவி சாய்ப்பதில்லை. அதிலும் குறிப்பாக உலக உணவு திட்டம் FAO இந்த புதிய சட்ட திருத்தத்துக்குரிய நிதியை வழங்குகின்றார்கள். ஆனால் அரசாங்கமும் FAOவும் சேர்ந்து எங்கள் மீது திணிக்கின்றார்கள். ஆனால் கடல் எங்களுடையது, நாடு எங்களுடையது. எங்களுடைய இறைமையான பகுதியிலே எது நல்லது எது கெட்டது என்று கடற்தொழிலாளர்களோடையோ அல்லது இந்த நாட்டின் புத்திஜீவிகளோடையோ கலந்துரையாடாமல் FAOவும் அரசாங்கமும் IMF நிகழ்ச்சி நிரலிலே இந்த சட்டங்களை கொண்டு வந்து எங்களை முதலாளி வர்க்கத்துக்கு அடிமையாக்கிறது. எங்கள் மீது காட்டுகின்ற கரிசனை என்ற போர்வையிலே எங்களை அடிமையாக்கின்றது, வேதனை அளிக்கின்றது, கவனை அளிக்கின்றது. எனவே இந்த வடக்கு கடற்றொழில் சமூகம் நாங்களும் இலங்கை மக்கள் என்று வாழ்வதற்கு எங்களுடைய பிரச்சனையையும் இந்த சந்தர்ப்பத்திலே இந்த யுக்திய இணையதளம் ஊடாக தெரிவிப்பதற்கு சந்தர்ப்பத்தை தந்ததையிட்டு இதற்கு இந்த வாய்ப்பை தந்த அத்தனை பேருக்கும் நான் நன்றி கூறி விடைபெறுகின்றேன். நன்றி, வணக்கம்.
Thank you, Mr. Anarasa. I'll just give like 3 pointers from his speech, where he highlighted that the fishing community has been alienated from food, from the sea, from the resources through which they were earning livelihoods because of these policies, especially that focus on export-oriented market. And also he highlighted how recently there are several legal reforms that are being implemented, and particularly the Fisheries Act, that are drafted by the government in favor of the capitalist and the export business of the country. Melanie?
Thank you, Yadu. Thank you, Mr. Anarasa. So I would like to turn towards Ms. Iromi Pereira, who's a researcher from Colombo Urban Labs and from Feminist Collective for Economic Justice. So her work has been mostly around the urban poor community, who are also, in addition to being the victims of economic crisis, in addition to being victims of the pandemic, they're also going to be heavily impacted with the climate crisis. So I would like to ask from Iromi, through her research, how do you see the impact on urban poor communities? How do you see the economic crisis impact on the urban poor communities? How has their lives changed, and how would their lives be further impacted? Yeah.
Thanks, Melanie. So to answer your question, I'll be drawing from primary research that we've been doing in Colombo over the last 4 years in low-income communities in Colombo. So basically, I'm not going to get into a lot of the statistics because I think the first panel with Madhulika and Ailan covered that. But to say that most of the working class poor in Colombo went into the economic crisis not yet recovering from the COVID lockdown period, where they were already heavily in debt, had accumulated huge areas when it comes to their electricity, water bills, their rent, mortgages, leasing. So there had already been a significant asset loss by the time the economic crisis started, or at least it started being felt in early to mid 2022. So in that sense, you have to take the impact of the economic crisis and of the IMF reforms with that in mind. So to say that it didn't start at that point, but these are these impacted communities who had been kind of struggling for quite a while. There have been quite a lot of impacts, but I think for today, to answer your question on this panel, I'll just talk about two particular types of impact through this reform program. One is through the electricity tariff hikes, and the other one is regard to the impact on nutrition and education. So one of the, oh, sorry, I forgot I had slides, I kept looking up. So these are some of the key issues that we've been seeing in Colombo. And I'm happy to pick up any of the others during the Q&A. But here I'll just talk about the issues around disconnection and the impact on nutrition and health. So just to give you an example, a lot of the communities that we work with, the number of units that they use, even if it's for a small house, is almost the same as what you would see in a middle-class home. And that's because Colombo's urban poor, their development indicators are extremely high. And you can't compare that with other global south cities in terms of infrastructure, in terms of access to the grid, in terms of assets. They are on par with middle-class homes, even if they're income poor or if their savings are low. So in that sense, when you have something like a 400% electricity tariff hike in less than 1 year at a time, and the first hike came, if you remember, when food inflation was 90%. So it was sort of back-to-back shocks. So an electricity bill of about 1,500 immediately went up to about 8,000. And in the last 2 years, what we've seen is, I have personally seen dozens of electricity bills that are in the 6 figures. The stories of disconnection are immense. So if you have all these kinds of competing expenses, and it's not just electricity, right? You saw food go up, you saw transport go up, you saw water go up, everything went up. And then obviously what happens is something has to give. And the first thing that gives is what you eat. So we saw communities cutting back first on the number of things they were eating, the number of nutritious things they were eating, then finally the number of meals they were eating. So, and it's again not just a matter of weeks. Here what we're seeing is people who are used to a diverse plate of food now reduced to eating very starch heavy, carbohydrate heavy. It's basically looking at addressing hunger and not nutrition. So in that sense, yeah, I think you can keep it here. So in that sense, what you see is you will have long-term impact on health, on education because of these kinds of cutbacks. And so this is a picture that actually someone in the community took last year. And it is a demonstration of, like, this for them is a treat. And the plate without the egg is actually the mother's plate. The egg She only had money for one egg, which she cut into two and she gave to the two kids. So you see those kinds of sacrifices right across the board. And if you go to the next slide, so basically what our work is showing is that this is basically what a food plate looked like in early 2019. This is what a food plate looks like, the last one, on a really good day. And this is also not all 3 meals, this would be 1 meal. And I think to bring it back to the question and what we're talking about here today about austerity, about economic crisis, about reforms, is to say that when you look at this plate of food, it's not enough to, this is not a reflection of just price. It is not just a reflection of inflation. It's a reflection of how much was their electricity bill, how much was their water bill, and did paying those things that month, it affects what you can buy. Because then you're going to buy what is the cheapest, what requires the least amount of energy. So, for example, if you're low on money, if you're low on gas, you're not going to buy things like chickpeas, like mung atta, because they take a really long time to cook. So you're going to be eating and buying things that are really fast to cook, doesn't require a lot of water to cook with, and doesn't require any other sort of electrical appliances like fridges, like rice cookers, which are all time-saving devices that people use to cook. So to say that looking at this plate of food, you have to think of sort of a constellation of things that are going into everyday decision-making about what people are eating. And then that brings us to what is a broader problem across the board, which is a lack of social protection in this country for people. Why are we at a time when food inflation was so high, we were going through an economic crisis, we were having, queue upon queue upon queue, why are we then going towards more targeted social protection schemes like Aswasuma that are actually penalizing people for having worked hard? Because we have this rhetoric, right? If you want to do well, if you don't want to live on benefits, you have to work hard. So what does hard work look like? Hard work looks like a permanent house. Hard work looks like a gas cylinder. Hard work looks like a indoor bathroom. Hard work looks like electricity connection. Hard work looks like a motor bicycle. If you have any of those things, you get a score of 0 in Aswasuma. So these 22 indicators that were developed in early 2019, before Easter, before COVID, before economic crisis, are being used to score people at the peak of an unprecedented economic crisis. So we don't even have I don't even know what the word is at that time. If you're a government servant, if you're a World Bank official, if you are an IMF official, if you are okay with this level of targeted selection of beneficiaries, of people who are genuinely struggling to put even 2 meals on the table, I think that shows, I think for me that demonstrates exactly the kind of way that the everyday person is viewed in Sri Lanka. The IMF has a ceiling on social, IMF has a floor on social protection, which means it has declared the minimum amount we have to spend on social security. And I think it's really telling that we are maintaining the floor. We are not even thinking of going up. So technically we are not breaking any rules, but we are not making life better for everyday people either. And just to end to say that, the queues are gone. Everything looks the same on the street, but at least with the communities that we work with, we feel that things are actually a lot worse now than they were 2 years ago. So to say that life may look normal, the queues may be the same, but availability doesn't always mean affordability. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Irumi. මම ඊගාවට කතා කරන්න කැමති විදුර මුණසිංහ එක්ක විදුර නීතිය හා සමාජ භාරයේ කටයුතු කරන ගමන් ඒ වගේම නීතිඥවරයෙක්. ඉතින් විදුරගේ වැඩ කටයුතු ගොඩක්ම වෙන්නේ රූරල් පුව. එහෙම නැත්නම් ගැමි ගොවි ප්‍රජාවන් එක්ක වැඩ කරනවා. ඒකෙදී මේ පහුගිය කාලේ ඇතිවෙච්ච අර්බුද පිටාපු අර්බුදත් එක්කත් මේ අපි දැන් මේ වෙද්දි ගමන් කරමින් යන මාර්ගයත් එක්කත් විශේෂයෙන්ම ගැමි ගොවි ආර්ථිකයට මේ කරහා ඇති වෙලා තියෙන බලපෑම ආහාර සුරක්ෂිතතාවය ඒ වගේම අපිට බෙදා හදාගෙන එහෙමත් නැත්නම් විශේෂයෙන්ම වනජීවි හා මිනිස් ගැටුම් එක්ක මේ අපේ ආහාර නිෂ්පාදන ක්‍රියාවලියට ඇති වෙලා තියෙන බලපෑම මේ ජන ජීවිතයට ඇති වෙලා තියෙන බලපෑම මේ එක්කත් එක්ක පොඩි අදහසක් දක්වන්න පුළුවන් ද විතර කොහොමද මිනිසුන්ට මේ ආර්ථික අර්බුදේ මේ අපි ගමන් කරමින් ඉන්න මාවත බලපෑමින් තියෙන්නේ සහ තව දුරටත් මේක ඉදිරියේදී කොයිතරම් බරපතල වෙන්න පුළුවන්ද කියන එක ගැන.
ස්තුතියි. මම ඉරෝමී නාගරික දරිද්‍රතාවයේ වැඩිවීම සහ ආහාර සම්බන්ධයෙන් ඇති වෙලා තිබ බලපෑම ගැන කතා කළා. මම එතනින්ම පටන් ගන්නම්. ඒ කියන්නේ අපි ලංකාවේ සංඛ්‍යාලේඛන බැලුවොත් ආහාර සුරක්ෂිතතාවය සම්බන්ධයෙන් මේ වෙනකොට ලෝක ආහාර වැඩසටහන කියනවා ලංකාවේ ජනගහනයෙන් 68%කට මේ වෙනකොට ඒගොල්ලෝ ආහාර සුරක්ෂිතතාවය පිළිබඳ අර්බුදයක ඉන්නවා කියලා. ජනගහනයෙන් 68%ක්. කියන්නේ ඒ අර්බුදය කියන්නේ රීරෝමි කියපු විදිහටම සමහරු වේල් 3 නොකන්න පුළුවන්, ඊට අඩු වේල් ගාණක් කන්න පුළුවන්. තව සමහරු ඒ කියන්නේ ඒ එක වේලක තියෙන ගුණාත්මක භාවය හෝ ප්‍රමාණය අඩු කරලා තියෙන්න පුළුවන්. තවත් සමහරු මෙච්චර කාලයක් තමන් ආහාරයට නොගත්ත තමන් අකමැති ආහාර සමහරලාවට කියන්නේ තමන්ගේ සර්වයිවල් එක වෙනුවෙන් ආහාරයට එකතු කරගෙන තියෙන්න පුළුවන්. මේ ආකාරයෙන් ශ්‍රී ලංකාවේ ජනගහනයෙන් 68%ක් තමන්ගේ ආහාරය වෙනස් කරගෙන තියෙනවා. ඊළඟට ලෝක ආහාර හා කෘෂිකර්ම සංවිධානය කියනවා ලංකාවේ ජනතාවගෙන් 17%ක් ඒ කියන්නේ මිලියන 3.9ක් ලක්ෂ 39ක් උග්‍ර මට්ටමේ ආහාර සම්බන්ධ ගැටලුවක ඉන්නවා කියලා. අපේ සෞඛ්‍ය ශාස්ත්‍රයේ සංඛ්‍යාලේඛන දිහා බැලුවොත් තව සෞඛ්‍ය අමාත්‍යාංශයේ යම් විදිහකට ප්‍රජා සෞඛ්‍ය කාර්යාංශය කරලා තියෙන අධ්‍යයනයන් අනුව පෙන්වනවා ලංකාවේ අවුරුදු 5ට අඩු දරුවන්ගෙන් 17%ක් විතර මේ වෙනකොට අඩුබර දරුවන් විදිහට ඉන්නේ. එයින් තවත් ජනගහනයෙන් අවුරුදු 5ට අඩු දරුවන්ගෙන් 10%කට වැඩි ප්‍රමාණයක් ඒගොල්ලෝ මේ යම් විදිහක ශාරීරිකව ඒගොල්ලන්ගේ මේ පෝෂණයේ ගැටලු නිරූපණය කරනවා ඒගොල්ලන්ගේ වර්ධනයේ. එතකොට මේ විදිහට ලංකාවේ මේ වෙනකොට ඊටාම මෑත ඉතිහාසයේ තිබ්බ අපිට අත්දකින්න ලැබෙන ආහාර සුරක්ෂිතතාවය සම්බන්ධ අර්බුදයක අපි ඉන්නවා. අනිත් පැත්තට ලංකාවේ මේ වෙනකොට ජනතාවගෙන් 40%ක් තමන්ගේ සෞඛ්‍ය සඳහා වන වියදම් අඩු කරලා තියෙනවා. එතකොට ඒකත් එකතු වෙනවා නැවත ආහාර ගැටලුව නිසා ඇතිවන අර්බුදයට තව එකතුවක් විදියට සෞඛ්‍ය සම්බන්ධයෙන් වෙන වියදම් අඩු කිරීම විසින් ඇති කරපු තත්වය තවත් තීව්‍ර කරන්න සම්බන්ධ වෙලා තියෙනවා. අපි බැලුවොත් මේ ආහාර නිෂ්පාදනය කරන්නේ කවුද කියලා. මේ ආහාර නිෂ්පාදනය කරන්නේ ලංකාවේ අති බහුතරයක් සුළු ගැමි ගොවීන් විසින්. ලංකාවේ ආහාර පරිභෝජනය කරන ආහාර වලින් 80%ක් විතරම කුඩා ඉඩම්වල ගොවිතැන් කරන ගොවීන් විසින් තමයි ආහාර නිෂ්පාදනය කරන්නේ. මේක ගත්තොත් ආසියාව සහ උපසහාර අප්‍රිකාවෙත් ආහාර නිෂ්පාදනයේ 80%ක් ඊට වැඩි ප්‍රමාණයක් කරන්නේ මොවුන් විසින්. නමුත් ගැටලුව තමයි මේ වෙනකොට අපිට යෝජනා කරන මේ නිර්දේශත් ආධාර දෙන සංවිධාන විසින් දිගින් දිගට කියපු සහ අලුතෙන් පනවලා තියෙන නිර්දේශත් ලංකාවේ පවතින රජයන් විසින් දිගටම ප්‍රවර්ධනය කරපු අපේ ආහාර නිෂ්පාදනයේ ස්වරූපය මේ ගැමි ගොවි සුළු ඉඩම් හිමි ගොවීන්ගේ ආහාර නිෂ්පාදනයට අකුල් හෙලන ඒක යම් විදිහක නොවැදගත් ලෙස සලකන ප්‍රතිපත්තියක තමයි අනුගමනය කරගෙන තිබුණේ. ඒක තවදුරටත් මේ වෙනකොට තීව්‍ර වෙලා තියෙනවා. ඒකට මේ වෙනකොට ප්‍රවර්ධනය කෙරෙමින් තියෙන්නේ මහා පරිමාණයෙන් සිද්ධ වෙන විශාල ප්‍රාග්ධන ආයෝජන සහිතව සිද්ධ වෙන විශාල සමාගම් විශාල මහා පරිමාණ විදේශ ව්‍යවසායන්ගේ මෙතිහත් වීමෙන් සිද්ධ වෙන ඒකභෝග වගාවන්ට අපනයන ඉලක්ක කරගත් ඒකභෝග වගාවන් තමයි ප්‍රවර්ධනය කෙරෙන්නේ. නමුත් අපේ ජනතාවගෙන් 80%ක් ආහාරයට ගන්නේ මේ සුළු ගැමි ගොවීන් නිෂ්පාදනය කරන කුඩා බිම් ඒකකවල නිෂ්පාදනය කරන ආහාර. දැන් මේවට ඇති වෙලා තියෙන අර්බුදය මොකද්ද කියලා අපි බැලුවොත් මේ වෙනකොට මේ කුඩා ඉඩම් හිමි ගොවීන්ගේ නිෂ්පාදනය සම්පූර්ණයෙන්ම ඇදවට්ටල දාලා තියෙන්නේ. දැන් ඒගොල්ලෝ ගත්තොත් බීජවල අයිතිය මේ වෙනකොට ගොවීන්ට නැහැ. බීජ සම්බන්ධයෙන් විශාල මිලක් දැම්මින් ඒවා මහ පරිමාණ සමාගම් වලින් මිලදී ගන්න සිද්ධ වෙලා තියෙනවා ගොවීන්ට. ඊළඟට පොහොර සහන ආධාරය මේ වෙනකොට කපාදු කරලා තියෙනවා. කෘමිනාශක වල මිල 3 ගුණයක් ඉහළ ගිහිලා තියෙනවා. ඊළඟට වෙනත් යෙදවුම් ගත්තොත් අපි ගත්තොත් මේ සියල්ලේ මිල ඉහළ ගිහිලා තියෙනවා. යන්ත්‍රෝපකරණ ගත්තොත් ඒවා මිල ඉහළ ගිහිලා තියෙනවා. ඒවට අවශ්‍ය බදු සහන ලැබිලා නැහැ. එතකොට මේවට විශාල මිලක් ගෙවන්න වෙලා තියෙනවා. ඊට පස්සේ ජලය සම්බන්ධයෙන් ගොවීන්ට ලොකු අර්බුද තියෙනවා. ජලය ලබා ගැනීමේ ගැටලු තියෙනවා. ජලය නිසිකල්ට ලැබීම නිසා අස්වනු පිළිබඳ ගැටලු ඇති වෙලා තියෙනවා. ඊළඟට ජලයේ පෞද්ගලිකකරණය කිරීමේ යෝජනා ඉදිරිපත් වෙලා තියෙනවා. ඒකේ ප්‍රතිඵලයක් විදිහට ගොවීන්ට ඉස්සරහට ජලයට ගෙවන්න වුණොත් මේ ගොවිතැන කරගෙන යාම තවදුරටත් කරන්න නොහැකි තත්ත්වයක් ඇති වෙලා තියෙනවා. ඊළඟට මෙහෙම කරන ගොවිතැන අස්වනු නෙළන කාලයට ඒ අස්වනු වර්ග ඒ අස්වැන්නට අදාළ භෝගය පිටරටින් ආනයනය කරනවා. එතකොට මිල බහිනවා. ඊළඟ මේ අස්වනු මිලදී ගැනීමේ යාන්ත්‍රණයක් නැහැ. ඒකෙන් රජය අයින් වෙලා තියෙනවා. ඊට පස්සේ ගොවීන්ට මේ නිෂ්පාදනය කිරීම සඳහා වන ණය සඳහා වන ප්‍රවේශය අහිමි කරලා තියෙනවා. රාජ්‍ය බැංකු වලින් තවදුරටත් ගොවීන්ට ණය ලබා ගැනීම හැකියාවක් නැහැ. ඒව ලබා දීමින් තියෙන්නේ විශාල පරිමාණ නිෂ්පාදකයින්ට. ඊට පස්සේ වෙළඳපොළ වලට සම්බන්ධයෙන් ප්‍රශ්න තියෙනවා. ප්‍රවාහන වීදම් වැඩි වෙලා තියෙනවා. මේ සියල්ල එකතුවක් වෙනුවට විදිහට ලංකාවේ ආහාර වලින් 80%ක් නිෂ්පාදනය කරන ගොවීන් තවදුරටත් මේ ආහාර නිෂ්පාදන යෙදීම අසාර්ථක ඵලදායී නොවන තත්වයකට පත් කරලා තියෙනවා. ඒ කියන්නේ පත් කරලා තියෙනවා. එතකොට වෙලා තියෙන දේ තමයි අනිත් පැත්තෙන් රජයේ දිගටම කියනවා මේ සුළු ඉඩම් හිමි ගොවීන්ගේ ගොවිතැන අසාර්ථකයි කියලා. හැබැයි අපි දැක්කා කොවිඩ් වසංගතය වෙලාවෙත් ආර්ථික අර්බුදයේ වෙලාවෙත් ප්‍රවාහනයේ අඩපණ වෙලා තියෙද්දි ඊළඟට සමස්ත ආහාර පද්ධතියම කඩා වැටෙමින් තියෙද්දි ලංකාවේ ආහාර නිෂ්පාදනය කළේ මේ ගොවීන්. ලංකාව බඩකිනේ නොහිටියේ මේ සුළු ඉඩම් හිමි ගොවීන්ගේ ආහාර නිෂ්පාදනය නිසා. හැබැයි ඒක එහෙම තීති රජයක පිළිඅරන් නැහැ කිසිම වෙලාවක. අනිත් පැත්තට රජය කියනවා මේක ඵලදායීතාවෙන් ඊටාම පහළ මේ ගොවිතැන තියෙන්නේ කියලා. හැබැයි ප්‍රශ්නය තමයි මෑතකදී ලෝක ආහාර එක්සත් ජාතීන්ගේ ආහාර කෘෂිකර්ම සංවිධානය කරපු පර්යේෂණයක් කළා. සංවර්ධන වෙමින් පවතින රටවල් 57ක හෙක්ටයාර මිලියන 37ක සුළු ඉඩම් හිමි ගොවීන්ගේ කෘෂිකර්මාන්තය සම්බන්ධයෙන් ඒකෙදී ඒගොල්ලෝගේ යම් විදිහක සොයා ගැනීම උනේ නිසි ගොවිතැන් ක්‍රම සහ නිසි කළමනාකරණය ඇතුලේ මේ ගොවිතැන සිද්ධ වෙනවා නම් මේකේ ඵලදායීතාවය 79%කින් වර්ධනය කරන්න පුළුවන් කියලා. හැබැයි ලංකාවේ ඔය මේ ප්‍රවර්ධනය කෙරෙමින් තියෙන මහා පරිමාණ ආයෝජන යටතේ කරන ඒකභෝග වගාවන්ට මේ වැනි ඵලදායීතාවයකට ලංවීමේවත් හැකියාවක් නැහැ. හැබැයි අනිත් පැත්තට දැන් මේ වෙනකොට මේ සියල්ල මේ ගොවිතැනෙන් ආහාර නිෂ්පාදනයේ ප්‍රධානම දායකයා 80%කට දායක වෙන මේ ගොවීන්ව ගොවිතැනෙන් අයින් කරන්න අවශ්‍ය යම් විදියක ව්‍යුහාත්මක සාධක නිර්මාණය කරද්දී දැන් ඒකට දරුණුම තර්ජනාත්මකයක්ම විදිහට රජය ක්‍රියාත්මක කරමින් කියනවා උරුමය කියලා වැඩසටහනක්. මේ උරුමය කියන වැඩසටහනෙන් සිද්ධ වෙන්නේ ඉඩම් ඒකක ලක්ෂ 20කට සින්නක් කර විකිණිය හැකි ඔප්පු ලබා දෙනවා. මේ ඉඩම් කියන්නේ මේ ආහාර භෝග වගාවට ගොඩක් යෙදවිච්ච ඉඩම්. මේවා තමයි ප්‍රධාන වශයෙන් ඉඩම් සංවර්ධන ආඥාපනත යටතේ බලපත්‍ර සහ දීමනා පත්‍ර විදිහට ගොවීන් වෙත ලබා දීලා ගොවීන් ගොවිතැන් කරපු ඉඩම්. එතකොට මේවා එක කොන්දේසියක් තිබ්බා. මේ තමයි මේවා ගොවි පන්තියෙන් එළියට බැහැර කරන්න බෑ කියන කොන්දේසියක් තිබ්බා. ලේ උරුමෙන් පවුලෙන් එළියට බැහැර කරන්න බෑ කියලා කොන්දේසියක්. එතකොට මේවා රජයේ නියාමනයේ යටතේ තමයි මේ ගොවිතැන මේ ඉඩම් වල භුක්තිය සහ හිමිකාරීත්වය මාරුනේ. හැබැයි පළවෙනි වතාවට රජය එකපාරටම තීරණයක් ගන්නවා කාටවත් අලුතෙන් ඉඩම් දෙන්න නෙමෙයි තියෙන ඉඩමට අදාළ අයිතිය සම්බන්ධ ලේඛනය මාරු කරන්න. ඒක තමයි රජයේ පාලනයේ යටතේ තියෙන දීමනා පත්‍රය හෝ බලපත්‍රය ආදේශ කරන්න විකිණිය හැකි ඔප්පුවකින්. එතකොට දැන් මේ ගොවිතැනෙන් ප්‍රතිලාභයක් ලබන්න බැරි ගොවිතැන පාඩු වෙන තත්ත්වයට පත් කළා ණය ගැති වෙලා ඉන්න ගොවියාට සුළු ඉඩම් හිමි ගොවියාට යෝජනා කරනවා ඔයාට දෙනවා ඔප්පුවක් විකුණ ගන්න පුළුවන්. එතකොට ඒ විකල්පය විසින් නැවත විශාල වශයෙන් ලංකාවේ ඉඩම් බැහැර කිරීමකට හේතුවක් වෙන්න පුළුවන් මේක ආහාර නිෂ්පාදනයේ ලොකු අර්බුදයක් වෙන්න පුළුවන්. හැබැයි මීට සමාන්තරව රජගෙන තවත් ක්‍රියාමාර්ග ගණනාවක් තියෙනවා. මහා පරිමාණ ව්‍යවසායන්ට ඉඩම් ලබා දීම සඳහා රජයේ ගිය අවුරුද්දේ අපි අයවැය කතාව ගත්තත් මුදල් ඇමතිවරයා විදිහට ජනාධිපතිවරයා කරපු විශාල ප්‍රමාණය නිකදිරි ගන්නවලා තියෙනවා. ඒකෙදි යෝජනා වුණා ජනතා වතු සංවර්ධන මණ්ඩලයේ රාජ්‍ය වැවිලි සංස්ථාව ඉඩම් ප්‍රතිසංස්කරණ කොමිෂන් සභාව යටතේ තියෙන ඉඩම් සමාගම් වලට ආයෝජන සඳහා ලබා දෙන්න. ඒ වගේම රාජ්‍ය සංස්ථා හා ව්‍යවස්ථාපිත ආයතන යටතේ තියෙන ඉඩම් ලබා දෙන්න. මේ දෙකම ක්‍රියාවට නැංගුවා. කැබිනට් තීරණයක් ගත්තා ඔය වතු ඉඩම් සම්බන්ධයෙන් පෙබරවාරි මාසෙදී පෙබරවාරි 12 වෙනිදා මාර්තු 4 වෙනිදා නැවත කැබිනට් තීරණයක් ගත්තා. ඉඩම් කළමනාකරන භාරයක් පිහිටවන්න ජනාධිපති ලේකම්වරයාගේ ප්‍රධානත්වයෙන් මේක යටතේ රජයේ ඉඩම් නැවත සමාගම් වෙත බැහැර කරන්න. ඊට අමතරව වනාන්තර ලෙස තියෙන ඉඩම් වන සංරක්ෂණ ආඥාපනත සංශෝධනය කළා. ඒ සඳහා දැන් ඉදිරිපත් වෙමින් තියෙනවා 20 වෙනි වගන්තියේ තියෙනවා වන සංරක්ෂණ ආඥාපනතේ රජයට අයත් වෙනත් ඉඩම් කියලා ප්‍රවර්ගයක් කැටගරි එකක් තියෙනවා. මේ කැටගරි එකට අයිති වෙන්නේ දැනට ජල පෝෂක ප්‍රදේශ ජලාශවල ජල පෝෂක ප්‍රදේශ විදිහට තියෙන අලිමං කඩවල් විදිහට තියෙන රක්ෂිත අතර සම්බන්ධය ගොඩනගන ඒ ප්‍රදේශ විදිහට නැත්නම් එහෙම නැත්නම් ගම්ම ජනාවාස සහ ගොවිබිම් අතර බෆර් සෝන් විදිහට තියෙන ඉඩම් මේවා අනාගතයේ යම් දවසක රක්ෂිත බවට පත් කිරීම සඳහා තමයි මේ කැටගරි එකට ඇතුළත් කරලා තිබෙන්නේ. හැබැයි දැන් මේ පනත සංශෝධනයත් එක්ක බහුවිධ කළමනාකරණ වනාන්තර කියන කැටගරියක් හදලා මේ යටතේ මේවා පුනර්ජනනීය බලශක්තිය සංචාරක කර්මාන්තය සහ වෙනත් විවිධ ව්‍යාපෘති සඳහා ලබා දීමේ අදහසක් තියෙනවා. මේක ලංකාවේ සමස්ත වනගහණයෙන් 18%ක් ආසන්න වශයෙන් අක්කර 8,60,000ක් විතර වෙනවා මෙතන. ඒකට මේ විදිහට මහා පරිමාණයෙන් ලංකාවේ ඉඩම් මේ වෙනකොට බැහැර කරමින් තියෙනවා මහා පරිමාණ ආයෝජන වලට සුළු ඉඩම් හිමි ගොවීන් ආහාර නිෂ්පාදනය කරන ගොවීන්ගේ ඉඩම් අනිත් පැත්තට බැහැර කිරීමට අවශ්‍ය කිසියම් විදිහක ව්‍යුහාත්මක කොන්දේසි තෘප්ත කරමින් තියෙනවා. එතකොට දැනටමත් දරුණු ආහාර සම්බන්ධයෙන් ගැටලුවකට මුහුණ දීලා තියෙන ජනතාවක් අනාගතයේ මේ ක්‍රියාමාර්ගයක තවත් අන්තරායකට අනතුරකට භාජනය වෙන නිමිතයි.
Thank you so much, Vidura. I'll some of the points that Vidura spoke about in English. So he mainly spoke about the food security, starting from where Iromi left, and he spoke how the whole population is impacted, drawing some of the researches done by a World Food Program, and also the malnourishment among the children has gone high. Because, and he also said that it's the small rural farmers who grow about 80% of the food that is eaten by the Sri Lankans. But the government and also these debt programs that has been implemented in Sri Lanka has been continuously pushing the small scale farmers out of their occupation and being trying to show this as like rural farming or the small scale farmers, their cultivations is not efficient. Right? Yeah. But if there is proper management of the rural farmers and allowing them access to debt and fertilizer, and if the problems that they're faced with getting sufficient water for the cultivations, then it could actually, it's possible to increase the efficiency by 79%. So this seems like a structural destruction of the small scale farmers who already doesn't have even seed sovereignty due to multinational corporations who've been trying to do monoculture cultivations. So especially the land problem that Sri Lanka has faced now, so there have been two policy decisions that has been taken to give away deeds, sellable deeds to the small scale farmers and also to the plantation workers. So with these reforms, it shows that the government is trying to allocate more and more lands for monoculture cultivations done by the private large-scale multinational corporations, and to push small-scale farmers away from farming. Thank you so much, Vidura, once again.
அடுத்ததாக நான் இளம் ஆய்வாளர்கள் வலையமைப்பிலிருந்து பேபிஷாலினி ராஜேஸ்வரன் அவர்களை அழைக்கிறேன். குறிப்பாக நீங்கள் இப்போ மலையக மக்களின் வாழ்க்கையில் மற்றும் அவர்களின் வாழ்வாதாரத்தில் இந்த நெருக்கடியானதும் அதற்கான தீர்வும் என்ன மாதிரியான தாக்கங்களை செலுத்துது என்று எங்களுக்கு
அனைவருக்கும் வணக்கம். மலையக பெருந்தோட்டங்களில் இந்த நெருக்கடியோட அந்த மக்கள் வாழ்வாதாரம் அதில் எவ்வாறு சமூக பொருளாதார தாக்கங்கள் ஏற்படுத்தி இருக்குது அப்படின்னு பார்க்கும்போது, முதலாவது அவங்களோட வருமானம் மற்றும் வாழ்க்கை செலவு அப்படிங்கிற விஷயத்தை பார்க்கலாம். இப்போ பொதுவாக பார்க்கும்போது மலையகத்தை பொறுத்த மட்டும் அந்த மக்கள் தொடர்ச்சியாக அவங்களோட சம்பளம் வந்து ஒரு குறைவான நிலையிலே தான் காணப்படுது. அதாவது அவங்க வாழ்க்கை செலவுக்கு ஏற்ற சம்பளம் இல்லாத ஒரு நிலை வந்து காணப்படுது. அது உதாரணமாக பார்க்கும்போது அவங்க இப்போ 1000 ரூபா சம்பளமும் பொறுத்த மட்டும் இது வந்து பொருளாதார நெருக்கீடுக்கு முன்பு அந்த மக்கள் கோரிக்கை விடுத்திருந்தாங்க 1000 ரூபா சம்பளம். ஆனால் அது வந்து பொருளாதார நெருக்கீடு கால பகுதியில் தான் அந்த 1000 ரூபா சம்பளம் வந்து அந்த மக்களுக்கு வந்து வழங்கப்பட்டது. ஆனால் வழங்கப்பட்ட பொழுதிலும் பார்த்தோம் அப்படின்னா பொருட்களின் விலை வந்து பொருளாதார நெருக்கீடு காலப்பகுதியில் பன்மடங்காக வந்து அதிகரிச்சிருக்கு. ஆனால் அவங்களோட அந்த மக்களின் சாதாரண சொன்னால் அவங்களோட ரியல் வேஜ் வந்து அவங்களுக்கு வந்து அதிகரிக்கப்படலை. அதனால் அந்த மக்கள் வந்து சாதாரணமாக தேசிய அளவில் மக்கள் வந்து பாதிக்கப்பட்டாலும் அந்த மக்களோட சம்பளம் வந்து மிகவும் குறைவாக காணப்படுறதால அவங்களோட அந்த வாழ்க்கை செலவு அவங்களால வந்து கொண்டு நடத்த முடியலை. அதனால அந்த மக்கள் கல்வி ரீதியெல்லாம் இருக்கலாம், சுகாதாரம், உணவு பாதுகாப்பு சார்ந்து பெரிதளவு பாதிக்கப்பட்டிருக்காங்க. இந்த மலேகா இளம் ஆய்வாளர் குழுவால் மேற்கொள்ளப்பட்ட கள விஜயங்களின் அடிப்படையில் எங்களுக்கு கிடைக்கப்பட்ட தரவுகளின் அடிப்படையில் இப்போ உணவு பாதுகாப்புன்னு பார்க்கும்போது அவங்க நாளாந்தம் வந்து உணவை வந்து ஒரு கார்போஹைட்ரேட் அதிகமாக வந்து சோறு 3 நேரம் உண்ற ஒரு நிலைக்கு வந்து அந்த மக்கள் வந்து தள்ளப்பட்டிருக்காங்க. அதே வேளை வந்து சில மாணவர்கள் கூட பாடசாலைக்கு வந்து கல்விக்காக போகிற நிலையை விட்டு அந்த உணவை பெற்றுக்கொள்ளலாம், அப்போ அதாவது அரசாங்கத்தால் கொடுக்கப்படுற அந்த உணவை பெற்றுக்கொள்ளலாம், அதுக்காக பாடசாலை செல்ல வேண்டிய நிலைக்கு வந்து அவங்க வந்து தள்ளப்பட்டிருக்காங்க. இதே வேளை வந்து கல்வி ரீதியாக பார்க்கும்போது மாணவர்களுக்கு வந்து பாடசாலை உபகரணங்களை வந்து அந்த பெற்றோர்களால் வந்து பெற்றுக் கொடுக்க முடியலை. ஏன்னா பாடசாலை உபகரணங்களும் பெரிதளவு விலை வந்து அதிகரிச்சிருக்கு. அதனால் பெரியளவான கொமனாக வந்து மலையகத்தில் ட்ராப் அவுட்ஸ் வந்து காணப்பட்டாலும் பாடசாலை இடைவிலக்கல் காணப்பட்டாலும் ஆனால் அந்த கிரைசிஸ் பீரியடில் வந்து பாரியளவு வந்து அதிகரிச்சிருக்கு. அதே மாதிரி பார்த்தோன்னா இது வந்து மலையக பெருந்தோட்ட மக்கள், அதாவது தேயிலை தோட்டத்தில் வேலை செய்கிற மக்கள், இதே நாட்கூலி வேலை செய்கிற மக்களும் ஒவ்வொரு நாளும் வேலைக்கு போனால் தான் அந்த 1500 ரூபாய் அதிலே அவங்களோட நாளாந்த செலவை செய்யக்கூடிய ஒரு நிலை காணப்படுது. அப்படி அவங்க வேலைக்கு போகலைன்னா அவங்கள அந்த அவங்கள அன்றாட தேவையவே அவங்களால பூர்த்தி செய்ய முடியாது. மேலும் அவங்க வந்து வேறு செலவுகளுக்கு வந்து வேறு கடன் அந்த மாதிரி விஷயங்களில் தான் ஈடுபடுறாங்க. இப்போதைக்கு அவங்க வந்து அன்றைய நாளுக்கான தேவை அன்றாட உணவு அதற்காக தான் அந்த மக்கள் வந்து நாளாந்தம் வந்து கஷ்டப்பட்டுட்டு இருக்காங்க. இதே நிலை வந்து அந்த மக்கள்கிட்ட வந்து இப்போ பொருளாதார நெருக்கீடுன்னு பார்க்க அவங்களுக்கு வந்து அவங்களோட உணவை சரியாக உற்பத்தி செய்யலாம், இல்லைன்னா அவங்க அந்த சில ரிசோர்ஸ் வளங்கள் இருக்கும்போது அதன் மூலமாக அவங்களோட வாழ்வாதாரத்தை பார்க்கலான்னு பார்க்கும்போது அதுலேயும் அந்த மக்கள் வந்து பெரிதளவு பாதிக்கப்படுறாங்க. பொதுவாக தெரியும் மலையகத்தில் வந்து அவங்களோட காணி உரிமை வந்து ஒரு நீண்ட காலமாக ஒரு பிரச்சனையாக வந்து காணப்படுது. அந்த சந்தர்ப்பத்தில் அவங்களுக்கு வந்து இப்போ நெருக்கீடு காலப்பகுதியில் சில இளைஞர்களே வந்து அந்த சில தரிசு நிலங்களை தாங்கள் விவசாயம் செய்ய போகிறோம், ஏன்னா அந்த வழி தெரியலை, அவங்களால ஏதாவது ஒரு உற்பத்தியை செய்தாகணும், அந்த நேரத்தில் வந்து விவசாய நடவடிக்கைகளில் ஈடுபடுறாங்க. இப்போ சில விவசாயிகள் அதை நம்ம பொதுவாக பார்த்தா அவங்களுக்கு வந்து அந்த ஒப்பு இல்லாதனால நாங்கள் வந்து அந்த முறைசாரா காணியில் தான் அவங்க விவசாயம் செய்கிறாங்கன்னு நாங்கள் ஐடென்டிஃபை பண்ணுறோம். அப்படி செய்தாலும் அவங்களோட அதுலேயும் அவங்க வந்து நிறைய பிரச்சனைகளை வந்து எதிர்கொள்கிறாங்க. அந்த எஸ்டேட் கம்பெனிகளுமே வந்து பெரிய முதலாளிமார்களுக்கு தான் அவங்களோட உணவு உற்பத்தியை அதிகரிக்கிறதுக்கு காணியை வழங்குத ஒழிய அந்த மக்களின் உணவு உற்பத்தி அதிகரிக்கிறதுக்கு காணியை வந்து ஓரளவு ஒரு உறுதி இல்லாட்டியுமே ஓரளவு இந்த கிரைசிஸ் பீரியடில் சரி அந்த மக்கள் அவங்களோட உணவு உற்பத்தியை அதிகரிக்கிறதுக்கோ அதுக்கான அந்த காணியை வந்து பகிர்ந்தளிக்கிறதுக்கு வந்து முன் வரலை. அவ்வாறே அப்போ அந்த மக்களுக்கு வந்து நாங்கள் தீர்வுன்னு பார்க்கும்போது அந்த மக்கள் ஓரளவு ஒரு குழுவாக இயங்கி அந்த மக்கள் அந்த நிலங்களை அதை வந்து இது வந்து பெரிய அவங்களுக்கு ஒரு நல்ல ஒரு ஆர்கியூ பண்ணலாம். ஏன்னா தி கிரைசிஸ் பீரியட், ஏன்னா ஒரு உணவு உற்பத்தி அதிகரிக்கிறதுக்கு காணியை தேவை அப்படின்னு கேட்கும்போது கவர்மெண்டால் அதை வந்து இல்லைன்னு சொல்ல முடியாத ஒரு நிலை காணப்படுது. அதனால் எங்களோட தீர்வு என்னென்னா ஒரு கலெக்டிவாக அந்த மக்கள் வந்து இணைஞ்சு அங்கே இருக்கிற நிலங்களில் வந்து விவசாயம் மேற்கொள்கிறது, அது சார்ந்த கூட்டுறவு சங்கங்களை உருவாக்கி அதனூடாக வந்து அவங்க அந்த விவசாயத்தை மேற்கொள்கிறது ஒரு தீர்வு அமையும்னு நாங்கள் யோசிக்கிறேன். தேங்க்யூ.
Thank you, Baby Shalini. I would just summarize what she said in English. Baby Shalini was highlighting on the increased cost of living among the plantation workers, and their real wages have been repressed. And also she highlighted food insecurity among the plantation workers, where they have reduced their food intake and the kinds of food intake they were taking before the crisis, for instance. And also, although there has been Hill Country has been known for school dropouts, with the crisis there is a significant increase in school dropouts, particularly because the prices or the cost of stationery necessary for education has increased with this economic crisis. And also towards the end she also highlighted that there is an attempt among the Hill Country Tamils to produce their own food in the informal land, that is where they are living in those estates. But then again, those are also being affected because they can't claim right over the food that's being produced, but particularly because of lack of land rights to the community, as well as because they do not own those lands. The government also do not provide necessary support for the food production that is crucial for the community that is producing food, as well as the rest of the country.
Thanks, Yadu. I'd like to next turn to Professor Shamala Kumar. She is a professor from the University of Peradeniya and also a member of the Kupi Collective. So we hear a lot about brain drain, and we also hear a lot about the educational reforms. And we see, university students protesting, and sometimes the academic stuff and the non-academic stuff. So among all of this, how is the education sector as a whole, and especially the higher education of the country, is impacted? And given the road that we are taking, right, and the changes and the policy changes that are being implemented, what do you see the future could be for the education sector in Sri Lanka?
Thanks, Melanie. Can you hear? Oh, okay. So I just wanted to bring up kind of what's happening first in the higher education sector, because I think somebody, I can't remember who, somebody said that you can't address these the people who are in that context. It's very difficult for them alone to address the issue. But I think when it comes to higher education, it's not just the people within the higher education sector, because ideologically there's a problem within the sector. So for example, even 7-8 years ago, if we talk to university teachers about the dismantling of higher education, free education in the higher education sector, there would have been a lot of people who spoke on behalf of it. But today the situation is very, very different. So when we are going through... Okay, can you hear me now? Okay. When you talk about it today, right now there are multiple processes through which we are dismantling free education in the higher education sector. Some of it is happening within the system, some of it is happening from outside, some of it is happening legally, sometimes it's happening illegally, and all of that is happening, and there are very few people to speak on behalf of it. And I feel that therefore there is a really huge need to say, you cannot rely on just the people within the sector to address this issue. Also because if you watch the news and watch the way people talk about this issue, you will see that students who go out and protest have been vilified. So there have been silence through this labeling of as ungrateful students, rowdy students, things like that. And the same with teachers, not just university teachers, but school teachers. They're bad teachers, teachers who want to do nothing, and therefore they are speaking out. Those kinds of labeling and a lot of other messaging about how ineffective our system is, how much our students are not getting jobs. All these things are used to sort of prevent people who are really concerned about what's happening right now from speaking and being heard. There's a problem there. So specifically, but actually there's a huge problem. So in all of our universities, I'm from Peradeniya, this includes Peradeniya, there's a current attempt to create a parallel fee-levying university structure. That because we don't have money, because university, we don't even have money for paper sometimes, within the university system, we don't know how to handle it, because we need money, and this is a way to get resources. So that's happening. Then in addition to that, you may have heard about the National Educational Policy Framework. Now this is broader than higher education, and I just wanted to read out 5 things that they think are the key problems in the education sector today. And just from listening to the panelists so far, you might want to imagine what are the key issues that you might consider are plaguing the education sector today. So they list education key actors are not working together, exam-driven system that stifles creativity, multiple progression paths without linkages, digital divide, investment deployed without ROI, return on investment. Consider this last point, knowing that Sri Lanka has the second lowest GDP proportion allocated to education. How can we talk about ROI? So it is in this, this is what the NEPF sees as the key problems of the education. I'm not saying that maybe there are problems, but are those the problems that we come to our head when we are talking about the crisis that is happening today in education? Then at the same time, there is attempts to create a pathway for private education and for fee-levying education through the KDU. KDU does not have a mandate to take civilian students, but now they have advertised and they're going to select people. Okay? They've been doing it for a while, so actually what they're doing is illegal. Now, maybe you have no issues with fee-levying education, maybe you don't have a problem with private education, but I think this is something that should come through a consultative process with the people of this country, just like they did when our existing policy was created. But that's not how this is happening. This is happening behind back doors. We don't know who's drafting these documents. We don't know who's being consulted. So it is not the way a democracy handles education. So my sense is, so we have the KDU issue, then we have the current situation where we are underfunding public education, we are having new policies being drafted. All of them, if you look at them overall, are made possible because of an ideological position that we have now decided we are okay with this dismantling of free education without actually a dialogue. And secondly, through the lack of funding, progressively like starving the system to death, essentially. So, and we know who's going to benefit from this and who is going to be left behind. And I think that's where we need to start. And I think maybe in this forum, we have, somebody mentioned hope and imagination. hope and imaginations are this should be the key of any education system. And without an education system, what are we actually hoping and imagining our future to be? I think we really need to take this seriously, and we have to connect what's going on in I didn't mention education, but education and general education and higher education, with all the issues that have been brought up from these panelists, to create some kind of cohesive understanding, coherent and cohesive understanding of what's going on, and how can we actually co-opt our system of education so that we can speak about these things through education strategy. They should be the center of it. And I want to bring one point out because of the forum we are in. We also need to think about public funding for research. Right now, especially in the social sciences, these are minimal. That means there's only funding for research that people have are donor-driven. So that means that there's some agenda behind them. It means that researchers can't have a program of research built on certain public interests. We can't have these kinds of forums. It's harder to have these kinds of forums within universities. So I think we have to think about this research issue along with the broader issues of education. Thanks.
Finally, I would like to invite Mr. Teagle to speak to us about the legal reforms that are happening. And Mr., I would pose a question, because today in this panel we are also hearing from Vidura, from Anarasa, different kinds of legal reforms that are catered towards towards the commercialization of food and all of that, and especially having a significant economic aspect. But I would like to also hear from you on the kind of laws or legal reforms that are taking place, which would also suppress and repress people from mobilizing, from resisting against these kinds of material impact, all these reforms that are going to have on us. Yeah.
Thanks, Yadursha. I think the backdrop for my intervention is very clear, considering all the other speakers today have raised in some form or the other some kind of law reform, some kind of legal measure that has been taken to curtail rights, to restrict livelihoods, to dispossess people, to make changes to land rights, and in many ways affect the economic security, social protections that people have enjoyed, and perhaps also deny them those in the future. So in that backdrop, and having it being said at the very beginning of this forum that all these laws are coming in from being formulated by a government without a mandate, being passed by a parliament that has lost the confidence of the people, which was demonstrable by the uprising of citizens in 2022, so that no parliamentarian, no representative right now really has that authority, that legitimacy to be passing laws. We have seen a rapid law reform agenda in the last 2 years. It has been, on one hand, a slew of laws that have affected economic, social rights of people. We are looking at the Inland Revenue Amendment Act, which pushed the ETF to accept a swap in the bonds affecting the interest savings. We are looking at the Central Bank Act. We are looking at microcredit and finance regulation bill that came up in the midst of a debt issue for individuals, right? A household debt. Just yesterday, we had the president talk about economic transformation law, public debt management law, public finance law. We do not know as citizens what is in these new pieces of legislation. We haven't seen a scrap of paper, background document, explaining what the research is, what the motivations are, what it's going to look like in terms of a plan. And it's Again, Aswasuma being gazetted, not a particular law, but the use of a law to gazette Aswasuma, which people did not know what the program looked like before it was rolled out. And we're still having individuals question and ask what's going to happen to the old scheme, the Samurdhi savings. All these questions are at the back of people's mind, creating a lot of insecurity, a lot of indeterminacy about what people's futures look like. We also saw proposals for labor law reform that really scared workers and trade unions in the country, because there were these devastating new changes that attacked the very premise of labor rights, which is that the employee-employee relationship is not an equal one. And we also are hearing about reforms to land-related laws, right? So this whole slew of laws and law reforms and new laws affect people in very fundamental ways, their livelihoods, their food security, the agriculture policy in this country, all those things that have meaning to how they are going to look after their children, what the next generation is going to have as wealth, and also our climate security, climate justice, right? Even our own environment, whether these new laws are taking those into consideration, there is not just a huge question mark, but there are real concerns. And as people reel from these difficulties, start talking about what they need and what they want, and raise their voices in terms of the problems and grievances that they are facing, we see another barrage of laws that silence them. So we've seen the Online Safety Act being enacted against many citizens who went to court. An unprecedented number of citizens, over 40, who went to court challenging the law, saying this is a law that will curtail the right to speak out, dissent, share information. And yet that law came through. We are also in Parliament right now, we have an anti-terrorism bill that looks very much like an anti-protest bill. We are also looking at, there's talk about a new NGO law that will also affect, in the versions that we have seen, will seriously affect the right to the freedom of association of citizens, organizations, collective action and mobilization in Sri Lanka. So there is a strong concerted effort to reduce, and I say the rights that the Constitution has granted, the rights that citizens have experienced in the most minimalistic way because of the war, because of various disasters and crises. We are rolling back on rights. We have not been given the opportunity to breathe and experience and build and expand our fundamental rights in Sri Lanka. This is taking the economic crisis as an opportunity of people on the back foot, of people being afraid of their financial security, and taking advantage of that to say, let's bring in more laws, let's govern with an iron fist and make sure that we introduce policies that serve us, political elite, business elite. The interests are really very clear in the law reform agenda. So if you look at the laws that have been coming in, we can see a growth of the executive. That is something that we've been seeing in studying these new laws. There are new competent authorities, there are new commissions, there is a growing executive power in a country that has extreme power in the executive, starting from the executive presidency. We are also seeing an expansion of criminal laws within each of these laws. So more and more tools for the police to interfere, to harass, to arrest, and to criminalize dissent even. Dissent is becoming stigmatized. I was just hearing Professor Shamlakumar talk about how different groups, whether students or lecturers, being cast in various terms, saying that, these are people that you should not be listening to, they are not productive citizens of this country. The laws themselves are doing it. When you criminalize certain actions, you are criminalizing, marginalizing, stigmatizing those with different ideas, those that are dissenting and asking for different solutions, and those that are voicing problems that you are not concerned about. And that is a serious concern in this. So really, we have to be asking for a halt in this law reform agenda. It is so fast, there is no transparency, there is no mandate, and there are serious incursions that we cannot roll back from. We cannot recover easily once the law is passed in a country where citizens also cannot challenge laws in court. We are one of the few countries that citizens don't have the right to challenge a law and say, actually this law now infringes my rights. So we are very much as citizens on the back foot, and this is moving 10, 50, 100 steps back in terms of the independence that we secured and the constitutions that we have put in place to protect citizens.
Thank you so much, Shamiza, and for all the other panel members as well.